So we are recording this for our folks online and for perpetuity purposes. We've been sending out email reminders to this, and we did ask, and I appreciate Ed reminding everybody to sign in. So when this meeting concludes and we've summarized all the meeting notes and presentations, we can send that out with the recording to all the participants that have been coming to these events. And
yeah,
it's actually pulling my bottom camera.
Oh,
I gotta change that real quick. So, joys of Zoom calls, hybrid meetings, changing cameras. So thank you for bearing with us.
can you see it?
Yeah, it's changed.
Did it change?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay.
Okay, now we're ready to start. So my counterpart leading this effort is Ms. Shannon Phillips with the Oklahoma Conservation Commission. So this is the third stakeholder meeting for the Illinois River Watershed Management Plan. And so I think, Shannon, do you want to say any words to start off? Okay. Trial by fire, here we go. So we're going to go ahead and get kicked off into just starting into this process of what this. Before we get going any further, we do have microphones, so hopefully everybody in the back here's okay. Okay, well, thank you to the Cherokee Nation again for hosting us for the second time for this meeting. We're extremely grateful for the venue, their hospitality at hosting us. And so just want to, again, express our gratitude to Tressa Pratt and her team at the venue. So today, what we're looking at is just a real quick introduction. And then we're going to get into kind of a review for those that didn't attend the first two meetings of what were covered in those. And then we're going to talk about kind of the model, the SWAT model soil water assessment tool. That's what we're going to be talking about today is the model outputs, but really getting into how we've aligned as two states working together to update this watershed management plan. And then we'll get into the data input summaries, and then we'll get into the really technical into the weeds and try and keep it pretty high level, but really explain what's going on with this model. And then we're going to get into what does that mean as far as the conservation practice implementation. And it's going to be a Q&A and an open forum for discussion with you all. That would be helpful.
Everything sounds great.
We good?
Good.
Okay, so what is a watershed management plan? For those that haven't been attending, there's three main features of a watershed management plan, really focusing on the water quality. That's our endpoint. As I mentioned in the past, this is a non-regulatory voluntary process, really focused in on bringing water bodies back into their Clean Water Act designated uses. So what we're talking about, fishable, swimmable. And there's other narrative and numeric criterion, but really this is a non-regulatory way to bring water bodies back into attainment through addressing non-point source pollution. So again, this is, everything that comes off the land that's not into pipe, not regulated. That's what we're trying to address through voluntary conservation practices. So there's really, even though these are EPA watershed management plans, that there's 9 elements of that EPA reviews, but there's 6 key steps in building a watershed management plan. The first one is what we're doing now, building partnerships. There's many in this room that work across state lines, work across our NGOs, work across our governmental organizations. And so this is building that first step, building those partnerships of ultimately how we're going to implement that watershed management plan. In those first 2 meetings, we characterized the watershed. We talked about land use changes. We talked about those water quality impairments from dissolved oxygen, aesthetics, pH in some instances, chlorides, pathogens, which is really E. coli. So that's what we've talked about. We've talked about how the land use changes have been driving some of these impairments. So that's characterizing the watershed. That's a big part of explaining how we're going to address non-point source issues. The next big step, and this is kind of on down the road, is the management goals. What are we trying to achieve? What is, besides attainment of water quality criterion, how are we going to do that? And that's the practices that we've kind of talked about last time, those conservation practices. You've heard about Farm Bill programs like EQIP. We're talking about riparian corridors, exclusionary fences. And then we're getting into how are we going to measure success? Those are those measurable actions, those tangible results. So that's something we'll be talking about into the future. The fourth step is really designing an implementation plan. What does that look like? How are we going to reach producers? How are we going to work with the municipalities and counties? How are organizations like Illinois River Watershed Partnership, Oklahoma Conservation Commission, our conservation districts, NRCS, how are we all going to work together with producers and our other entities out there that have networks to get conservation practices on the ground to ultimately make that water quality improvement. Then it comes to the implementation. This is where the rubber meets the road. We've talked about what are the goals, how are we going to measure success, what are those practices, who are those partners involved. Now we go out and implement. And so we're coming up to almost 7 years now since the last watershed management plan. Doing quick math, sorry. I'm a biologist, not an engineer. But it's now we're to that point where we need to come back, reevaluate success, look at it, and that's what we're doing right now. But this is always adaptive. This is iterative. So when we're out there, we're talking to everybody that are doing these practices. And that's what we talked about in that last meeting is what's working, why is it working, what's not working, and how do we overcome those hurdles and obstacles that prevent implementation of some really great conservation practices. So this is, again, a holistic approach to this watershed management plan process. This is something that we've been talking about from the very beginning with OCC, Natural and NRD in Arkansas, working together collaboratively. We've had, for the last 2 years now, probably almost 3, consistent meetings talking about this process. Our staffs have been have routine meetings talking about the technical information, talking about the process, how we're going to facilitate these meetings. So this is taking great strides in communicating how this is going to be working and implemented across a very large watershed. But the benefits of the plan is really to one, the water quality, to downstream users, downstream water intakes. It's really how can we implement conservation practices that I think how does conservation not cost but pay? So what we're looking at is low cost implementation practices that are ultimately going to have a higher return on investment. And then we're going to see increased landowner cost, profitability from producers, increased soil health, which leads to increased forb health, increased herd health. So there's an upchain from all of what we're trying to accomplish. And I've already mentioned this, restore fishable, swimmable, those designated uses. That's our goal, bring water bodies back into attainment. Okay, a real quick summary of the first meeting. I highlighted those land use changes. The last plan written in 2016, well, it was really started in 2014. A lot has happened in the watershed in nearly a decade. And we've talked about that. We see it in every meeting I attend in Northwest Arkansas. We're talking about land use changes over time. So this is important to account in this process. So we talked about land use changes. We talked about water quality impairments. And then Oklahoma did a really great job of capturing what they've done over the last decade, implementing non-point source practices in the Illinois watershed, leading to success stories. That's an EPA term for basically delisting, bringing those water bodies back into attainment. So that was meeting 1, really, again, characterizing the watershed, telling stakeholders what's been happening. The meeting 2 was really to work with the stakeholders to capture conservation practices. So we started off with a very broad introduction to conservation practices, and we broke it out into rural and urban working groups. And we asked some basic questions from our facilitators. Again, of these practices, what's working,
Why is it working? What's not working, and what hurdles are there to implement that practice? And then what are we not thinking about? What practices are out there that we're not even talking about that could be implemented? So I think I've already covered all that. Again, underutilized practices, barriers and challenges, and what's worked and why not. So for the rural practices, stream bank stabilization was one of the biggest topics. But one of the biggest limitations to this is it's extremely expensive. Bank stabilization can go anywhere from $250 to $500 per linear foot when you're really talking about it, or even higher in some instances if there's a lot of restraints. It's extremely expensive. Even with cost share programs, it's hard to implement these practices because landowners are having to come up with that capital to offset those costs. And then there's the concern that even if we do a bank stabilization project, that upstream land use changes, increased velocities may eventually degrade that project or ultimately, so it's a routine maintenance. So there's a lot of concerns with spending that type of money on a bank stream bank restoration project. Riparian restoration is a little bit different. This is a more of a passive approach where we're talking about exclusionary livestock fencing, offsets, tree plantings, riparian buffers, trees, herbaceous plants. While good in practice, a lot of producers are hesitant. This is one of the limitations because ultimately you have fertile land coming out of production. And how do we talk about offsetting those monetary values from loss of production? So that's a limitation, that's a hurdle, it's a challenge that we can look into the future of how do we address offsetting those monetary losses. Conservation easements. They're being utilized in Northwest Arkansas, but there's still a lot of knowledge gaps on what these really are, how they're utilized, what they mean to producers. Perpetuity, you hear that and that's a scary word for a lot of folks. So there's a lot of research going into what does a limited or time limited conservation easement look like, as well as just informing everybody of what conservation easements really do and how they can benefit the producer and the environment and have a lot of co-benefits to that. I mentioned livestock exclusionary fencing. There's a lot of work going on to implement exclusionary fencing. This not only is from, say, the main stem Illinois River, but from tributaries. And when you do this, there's other practices that have to carry with or basically accompany it, like alternative water sources, heavy use areas, because when you move livestock away from an area, you're concentrating them, and then you're ultimately having to provide a water source to them. So all this again comes at a cost through federal and state programs and cost share programs. Poultry litter management. We did spend a lot of time on poultry litter management. There's a lot of novel ideas being tossed around in the watershed right now, from biochar to gas production to creative ways of moving the litter. So there's a lot of topics on poultry litter management right now. From urban practices, one of the big topics there was rain garden workshops. Been very successful on informing from community gardeners, master naturalists, to school groups, to even municipalities implementing these at fairly large scales. So this is a version of a success of a conservation practices being utilized in the urban setting. Green infrastructure, this is synonymous with low impact development. You may hear soft engineering or green engineering versus our hard and gray engineering. So it's kind of a way to think about the infrastructure a little bit different. So we're talking permeable pavers, bioswales, detention, retention basins, phytoremediation, well, the list goes on. Green roofs. So again, this is being implemented in a lot of our urban centers in Northwest Arkansas, but without a lot of coordination on how to have the highest return on investment where these practices need to go, it's hard to take a more of a shotgun approach on getting, again, that higher return on investment. Same in the urban or the rural setting. Riparian corridors are extremely important. we've documented this through, a plethora of scientific literature. We know riparian corridors are important to our aquatic ecosystems, but they're very important in our upstream, our headwater systems, as well as they are on the main stem. So there's limitations there, from implementing conservation easements to working with municipalities, and then urban landowners that, again, like a lot of us, we enjoy that interface with the stream, but how do we sustainably manage that interface? So I quickly went through that, and I'll bring this slide back up at the end, but I just want to touch on it really quickly. So October last year was our first introductory meeting. We had one scheduled in February, but due to inclement weather, we had to postpone that until May. The third meeting, we're here. We need to coordinate, we being OCC and NRD and our consulting teams, to figure out when exactly this fourth meeting will come. But what we're really going to be planning on is more assimilating all this information that we've gathered from stakeholders on conservation practices and what you'll see today on the model output. And that's going to go into feeding basically a prioritization, a watershed prioritization. So by all means, what you're seeing today is not the finished product. We want to stress that. We still have a long way to go on our end on really understanding what this model means. And then there's a prioritization methodology. And that's really what's going to happen in meeting 4. And then sometime in early 2024 will probably be the final meetings. We'll be really wrapping up. So basically take what you see, that information in meeting 4, the information summary, management goals, implementation, adaptive management, shift that down one meeting. Meeting 4 is really going to be talking about our prioritization and taking all the model output, what we're talking about conservation practices, and say, this is really where we think we can have the highest return on investment improving water quality. So that said, our contact in Arkansas, working with FTN Associates, Mr. Philip Masur, that's his contact information. He'll be presenting a little bit later on. OCC, Shannon Phillips and Greg Clarkson, their contact. So any questions, feel free to reach out to either of us. Happy to answer any questions. We do plan on saving questions and answers to the end. I can take a couple, but I prefer to save it to the end, and we can talk about conservation practices, if everybody's okay with that. Shannon, any other remarks?
That's good stuff.
Okay. So we're going to jump right in. Actually, I think next up is Mr. Greg Clarkson. He's going to give you kind of an update on, again, how we got to this point. The watershed's a long storied history, but this is going to be an abbreviated version, really focused in on the model.
Thank you, Tate. How many of you, this is the first time you have attended a stakeholder meeting? So I think that this presentation you will find useful, because we're going to provide a little bit of background, provide some context for what we're about to deliver. I want to just go over very briefly some of the elements of history that kind of led us here to this process. And I'm trying to stand in front of the camera. I have no idea. I'm going to go ahead and turn that up, figuring that I'm above the view of the camera. So the first thing is to realize that what we're doing today is a result of an outgrowth of a collaboration that's been ongoing between the two states as well as EPA to develop tools to help us in decision-making for implementation in a non-regulatory framework. And I want to emphasize that non-point source, as opposed to what comes out of the end of a pipe, is a non-regulatory, by and large, field of pollution management. And so I hope everybody understands that what we're talking about is that element, a non-regulatory pollution management, those sources that come from a diffuse number of places across the landscape as a result of rainfall hitting the ground and carrying those eventually to our stream. And so that's what we're dealing with today. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about that element of pollution that makes it to Illinois River. What we see today is an outgrowth of a collaboration in what we call the watershed implementation Plan Advisory Work Group, and that comprised, again, the states of Oklahoma and Arkansas, and EPA and stakeholders. And from that work group evolved a technical work group, as well as the Cherokee Nation. I don't want to leave them out because they've been integral also to this effort, and I've always had a member involved or two involved, and have been gracious to host these meetings. So we're very thankful for that. But what we've done is we have come out of a long kind of technical review process and back and forth with a historical model to hone a approach to watershed modeling to eventually come to what we're going to talk a little bit about, providing a framework for the future. And that is to have a tool that lets us implement some scenarios of best management practices in each of the watersheds that will help abate the non-point source pollutants, sediment, phosphorus. Most people are familiar with that one, and perhaps nitrogen, maybe even bacteria and some other associated things. So that's what we're dealing with in terms of the watershed implementation plan and the outgrowth of that in a technical committee to develop a watershed model and application tools for us to do that, accomplish those efforts. This has been a collaborative approach. We've not been siloed in each of our states or each of our program areas, trying to just head down, do what we want to come up with, independent of each other. We're working together, and that will be maintained throughout this process as we continue. And what we're trying to do, or what the eventual product will be, each state's effort to develop their watershed based plans or watershed management plans updates. And like Tate said, 7 or 8 years since theirs, and I don't recall exactly how. That's at least the date for Oklahoma's as well. So each of the states will take this information, feed back into the specificity of each state's watershed management plans, and then we will bring that into an overarching binding document called the Watershed Implementation Plan, which will be the final product of this. And I believe the timeline, as I recall, Tate, is the end of 2024, as I recall. Each state in the approach from a modeling perspective and in developing a tool along that line for non-point source pollution management, recognize the strength of the soil and water assessment tool, otherwise known as SWOT. And so how many of you heard of SWOT? Just show of hands. Okay, so we don't have everyone completely ignorant of SWOT today. They've at least heard that acronym, Soil and Water Assessment Tool. And as the name implies, it is a very well-developed modeling tool that helps water quality pollution management agencies develop tools through that process to emulate and model what's going on in the landscape. And that's what a model is. Just to give you a real quick rundown or a perspective of a model, if any of you, all a model is something that is used to emulate reality, and then probe that emulation with scenarios to see what might be possible in terms of scenarios from a practice perspective and management perspective. And so that's what we develop models for. A lot of people, I think it's lost on them why, folks, and I think it's just nothing more than the love of people like Philip and other engineers that just like to play with numbers and use complicated applications that no one else really understands the black box perspective of except them. And that would include Tate and myself and Shannon, because we're biologists and ecologists and we're not modelers. But we've been around it long enough a little bit to kind of come into the knowledge a little bit of the usefulness of those tools. And I think the old adage from one particular person that's kind of a father of a lot of models was that all models are wrong and some are useful. And so what you're going to see presented today, and I'm going to say this multiple times, is not the end-all be-all emulation of reality, but it is a tool that helps us in the best possible frame model what might be possible in reality. Okay, that's what we're trying to do is to emulate reality. It's not perfect. Okay, so I'm going to say that over and over again. So we recognize the strength of SWOT. Each states, Arkansas, Oklahoma, have employed SWOT historically for numbers of years and have multiple SWOT models for various watersheds in their states, as well as this watershed, the Illinois River watershed. And so it's not without precedent. So I just wanted to make sure that we understood that historically. So talk just a little bit about, again, the SWOT model approach to what we're doing. What SWOT is, again, soil and water assessment tool, is strong in its ability is in modeling non-point source pollution, particularly landscapes that are dominated by agricultural land uses. This particular model was developed by academicians, folks that have tested, have proven, and is adopted and used worldwide, has, I believe, well over 25,000 academic-based citations that reference the use of SWOT. This is an extensively employed tool, not something new, not something that has not been proven for the purposes that we're employing it for. And again, this is just a refresh, honestly, of models that we have developed this watershed in the past through this actual tool. And so we're using this again. Once we get it, you develop the model. Here's the steps involved. What you do with a model is you employ folks like Philip, like Brad Rogers, folks that have that mindset towards the application, know how to use the application, feed it with the right data, set that model up to look as close as possible to reality, and then probe that model or that tool with possible scenarios to see what the response could potentially be, and then use that to help inform whether or not, we think that might be a strong possibility to actually employ in reality as far as practices. So that's our whole intent and purpose here. And at the end of the day, models, again, are not perfect. We are not presenting models that are a perfect emulation of the Illinois River watershed. We are presenting models today that are the first iteration of the full model being set with the data that we have, to then look at how they are emulating reality and if it is close or not. Okay. Looking at how they are emulating total phosphorus load delivery to the stream, sediment delivery, how they are most importantly emulating the hydrologic or the water process and dynamics within the watershed, okay, in terms of response from precipitation events and that kind of stuff. So that's what we're doing with this modeling exercise. Arkansas, they had an existing model, and we're looking at updating the data behind that, as well as some of the other elements of it. Oklahoma, we developed a new SWOT model to model the entirety of the watershed. Arkansas models predominantly the Arkansas portion of the watershed. Two different approaches, but two approaches that are being used collaboratively in a quality management process, in terms of us being able to compare and contrast our results, and then work collaboratively to find out where the differences might be, why those differences are there, and then come to some conclusions for management that are shared between the two states. So the states worked independently through contractors. Arkansas worked through FTN and Associates. The state of Oklahoma worked through Texas A&M through Dr. Serini and Katie Mendoza. And that's enough history on that. So today, what we want to do, and I'm going to say, I'm repeating myself because it's very important. We are presenting initial base SWOT models from each of the state's efforts to convey input data, the calibration approaches, and the performance so far where we're at today of those models. They are not done. Everyone see that? We're shaking our heads. We're not presenting a final model product. Most assuredly, from Oklahoma's standpoint, we are not. And so we have more collaboration, we have more tweaking things to do, but we want to give you a window into what we are seeing now and how the models are performing in terms of emulating the reality in the Illinois River watershed. And so again, I think a good thing to do is perhaps provide an example of an everyday model that probably most of you use a couple times a week. I use it every single day. How many of y'all ever use Google Maps? See, we have a laughter, because that's probably someone that has encountered the fallibility of that model, because the reliance of Google Maps 2 years ago compared to now is amazing. Because but yet it's still not good, perfect. We got led on about a 15-mile goose chase yesterday out in rural Nowata County, Oklahoma, because Google Maps it's still not accurate. But the reason for that is because it did not have good data. And so I want to put a real emphasis on what we're going to present today in terms of what the greatest Achilles heel of any modeling approach is going to be, aside from good common sense building or architecture of that model. Assuming that thing has been built to emulate things logically, if you do not have good data, I don't care how many bells and whistles you have in that model, it is not going to produce a good result. It will not emulate reality well. And so I'll give you a perfect example, Google Maps. If you live in a major metropolitan area, Google is updating data, uptaking data, ingesting data real time, 24/7, every second of the day. But at the end of the day, that is a model. I mean, it's not, you can look on that map and it'll say red on the street, but how many of y'all have ever gotten up to a red portion and you're sitting there going, why is it red? There's no longer a stoppage of traffic, because the data is that it's last based its outputs from is latent. So it doesn't have a refresh in that data to emulate reality more accurately. Is that a good example? That's exactly what we're doing here. It's just like Google Maps. The better data, the more current data, the more volume of data you have coming in, assuming it's good data, the better that model is going to represent reality. And I just want to, with that, just say one more time that what you will see today is the initial results of what we call baseline model results. That means when you get a model put together to emulate the reality of this system, the Illinois River watershed, what then you have to do then is put input data and run it to see what, with current day conditions, how well it is emulating current day conditions from the monitoring data. So what you do is you compare outputted data from the model to real data that came from actual water quality sampling. And so you see how that compare and contrast takes place, and then you make some assessments to determine how good that representation is. And so what you're going to see today is the baseline run scenario of each of the models. Again, still left to do some tweaking, some more calibration tweaks, some collaborative efforts to compare and contrast on some of the input stuff. I can't say that enough. Tate said it, and I've said it about at least 4, maybe 5 times. And so we'll end with that. I think one more thing, because Tate already covered a couple of my things, but my points on here, and I appreciate that. Again, when we get to the place after we go through a collaborative scenario after this meeting from a technical perspective, and we come to a place where we're feeling pretty good about our model performance on both sides, at that point in time, we have a tool we can then begin to implement what if scenarios. What if we decreased nutrient application in typical hay fields by this amount? What if we decreased litter application by this amount? What if we increased it by this amount? So what you do is you probe that model with different what if scenarios, see how it responds, and see if we have also too monitoring data during those times to see if that emulates it correctly or accurately. Okay, have I done okay, Tate, Shannon, in setting up the tone and where we're headed? Brad, Philip, anything else more to say? Okay. At this point in time, where are we going, Tate? We're going to go to Philip. All right, turn it over to Philip, 15 and Associates.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, make sure you guys
Stay in the right place.
All right, thank you, Greg. hard act to follow there. So anyway, like I say, my name is Philip Messier with FTN Associates. We're working on a contract to NRD. And as Greg said, we're developing the SWOT model for Arkansas, but working collaboratively with the Oklahoma folks. And that's been a great pleasure to work with them. And so I appreciate all their help. Like I say, we are, well, let me go ahead and get to the next slide. Oops.
May have to advance on the screen.
Yeah, you got it. Thank you. Okay, like I say, today I'll be talking about just kind of some of the model setup part, you know, what goes into the modeling, some of the inputs there, and then some of our calibration results at a very high level. And that goes back to what Greg was saying about comparing the model output with observed data. In other words, you know, how accurate are you, or how realistic are you representing what's going on in the watershed, and then also that how we'll be using that in the watershed management plan. This slide is an attempt to, as kind of a simplified attempt. You know, Greg was talking about the modeling being simplified. Well, our presentation is simplified too, in terms of all the stuff that's in the model. But like I say, the SWOT model, it does simulate the hydrologic and water quality processes that are occurring throughout a watershed. And basically it's taking things like some of those inputs you see on the left, with taking soils data, topography, land use data, weather data, point source data, and some other things like a lot of watershed characteristics. All of that stuff goes into the model with, there on the bottom of the screen, you see land management practices. Most of that is, well, not just agricultural practices, but if you had some urban things, if you're doing street sweeping or something like that, you could put that in the model too. So it puts all that in there. The model operates on a daily time step, and each day it looks at throughout the watershed. It looks at the rain, the precipitation that's falling, you know, how much of that precipitation infiltrates, how much of it runs off. The infiltration, does it, you know, percolate down into the lower levels of the soil? Is it taken up by plants, or is it taken up by evaporation, direct evaporation? So it tracks the water through the watershed with, like I say, within each sub watershed, and then, you know, routes things through stream channels, ponds, and reservoirs, and keeps track of quality along the way. And also part of the water quality comes from erosion calculations, both upland erosion as well as stream bank erosion. We'll talk about a little bit more about the stream bank erosion. It's pretty simplified, but it's got all those different processes, including things like with poultry litter that's applied. It looks at any nutrients that dissolve into the water that run off. So like I say, it tracks all that. But this is on a watershed scale. It's, you know, we can't simulate every little square inch of the watershed and pick up every little nuance. So like I say, we're doing this at a watershed level. And so the output that we'll be looking at today will include primarily, like that map you see there on the screen. We'll be looking at some of these average annual nutrient loads and sediment loads that are being predicted in different parts of the watershed, and be able to compare that from one area to another. And like I say, that we simulate a long time period. You see the time series graph there. We get time series output. We don't have much time series output to show you, because we've got output at so many different locations. Like, well, you'd be totally asleep by the time I presented all the time series plots there. So that's just like I say, quick overview of the model there. So for Arkansas, like I say, we're covering the Arkansas portion of the watershed, and what you see there in kind of that gold color is like those are the 12 watersheds, which are the sub watersheds identified by USGS. Those are the ones that are 50% or more in Arkansas. And what you see on the green portion of the screen there, that blue hexagon, if I can just see if I can get my laser pointer going here. Well, I can't figure out how to do that. Anyway, what you see on the Oklahoma side there, in order to have one model, the SWOT model can only have one outlet, so you've got to extend everything downstream to where all the parts of the Arkansas drainage converge. And so that essentially is at the confluence of Barren Fork and the main stem of the Illinois River. But so the model extends all the way into Illinois, but we didn't calibrate anything on the Oklahoma side on that any of that green area, and really just kind of ignored the output on that side because, like I say, Oklahoma's taking care of that side. Okay, so I mentioned that the model breaks things down. We've got everything divided. We start out dividing the subwatershed up spatially by the HUC 12 watersheds, and those are just 12-digit hydrologic unit codes. Those watersheds are typically, I want to say 15, 20,000, maybe a little bit more acres each. Those HUC 12 watersheds are identified, delineated by the U.S. Geological Survey. They're just a smaller component of the larger watersheds. It just makes a reasonable management unit to work off of. And so we start up by dividing things within those HUC 12s. Then we put, because that's where we want output at the outlet of each HUC 12. Then we say, okay, for each monitoring station, we need output there. So we add outlets there. So you wind up with more subbasins. We have 51 subbasins, and then the model will, within each subbasin, it will look at each unique combination of land use, slope, and soils, because it's got this spatial data at about a 30-meter resolution throughout each HUC 12. So you wind up with, you overlay those data sets, and you wind up with different combinations of land use, soils, and slope. And so it takes each unique combination and says it's called hydrologic response unit, or HRU, but that's the basic unit at which it does calculations for all this stuff for the whole water balance and hydrologic cycle. And so we wind up about 2,500 HRUs. And like I say, you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, that shows the subbasins, and the map on the left is just the HUC 12s there. Okay, start one of the weather inputs, or one of the inputs is weather data. That includes daily precipitation, temperature, air temperature, dew point temperature, and wind speed. Some of those parameters, like the dew point and wind speed, are used partly by the model to calculate evapotranspiration, and also, when I was talking about it simulating the water being taken up by plants, it simulates plant growth as well. It's one thing, if I could just tell it, I'd like to just tell it, I got plants there. I know I got plants, but it has to simulate that, because it simulates not only how much water they take up, but how much nutrients they take up. That's part of the whole cycle there. So that's part of what we're looking at. We used weather data. The precipitation and temperature were from, it's the PRISM out of data set that comes out of Oregon State. That's you can get it for pretty fine resolution spatially, and then the wind speed that came out of just the 5 airports that you see on the screen there. Land use. We use the 2019 National Land Cover Database. That's the most recent national or most recent database that covers both sides of the state line for the whole watershed. And like I say, you can see there, it's also, we've got the pie charts in there that show the kind of the distribution of land use. One of the things that I do want to point out there is here, especially in Northwest Arkansas, people are thinking, okay, yes, land use is changing. There's a lot of urbanization. Sometimes it may feel like, oh, the whole watershed is urban. Well, it's not quite. There's, as you can see on the map, there's obviously quite a bit of developed land over on the eastern side, but there's still, if you look at the pie charts there's still, quite a bit of forest and pasture land. And I will point out, if you're looking at some of those pie charts, but the urban percentages listed in both those may look a little bit high. That counts for everything in the NLCD that's considered developed, which includes high density, medium density, low density, and what they call developed open space, which can include some of the highways and some other areas. So that's probably a little bit higher than what most of us would really call urban. So I just wanted to point that out there. But like I said, all that land use data is an important part of the model. We have point sources now. As Tate mentioned, the whole emphasis of this program is, this effort is looking at non-regulated sources. That's absolutely true, but we have to have point sources in the model simply because in order to calibrate the model, we're comparing our output with observed data, and the observed data include the effects of both point sources and non-point sources. So that's why we include those in the model for calibration. Now, when we start looking at doing subwatershed ranking and doing those types of things, we'll turn off the point sources and just look at non-point sources. But the point sources are included for the model calibration. Stream bank erosion is something that we do have in the model. SWAT is not a settlement transport model. Never was intended to be, and it's like I said, it works on a watershed scale. So it has a relatively simplified method of stream bank erosion. We are very fortunate in this watershed that we have some measurements that have been made by the Natural State Streams Survey that was done in, well, it was published in 2021, but it's fairly recent. So we've got actual field measurements at the places where those triangles are shown on the map there. They also covered, looked at long stretches. Those are just the survey sites there. And the stream bank erosion, when they have measurements, we can't just take that and feed it right into the model. But what we can do is we can tweak some of the parameters in the model and then, just kind of look and see, are we being realistic based on what the observed data show. We also, the model also has management practices, including urban stuff, like the fertilization, lawn mowing, that type of thing, cattle grazing, dairy and hog farm manure. There are not too many dairy and hog farms in the state. I don't have those numbers with me. That's a relatively small number, but like I said, we do include that in the model. Also, we have poultry litter application, and I'm going to back up to the dairy and hog farm manure information that came from DEQ, since those are regulated facilities. Again, even though they're regulated, we still put them in the model just because that's part of the loading that's occurring. And with poultry litter application, we were fortunate to get data that NRD compiled for us from its data that are reported by producers that have nutrient management plans that are applying poultry litter. And so we had data from 2019 that NRD compiled for us on a HUC 12 basis. And that included the tons of litter that was applied in each HUC 12 and the number of acres that received poultry litter in each HUC 12. So like I said, we use that for the model. And one thing that I was a little bit surprised with when we cranked out those numbers is, and this is just on the Arkansas side here, the poultry litter was being applied on a little over 24,000 acres. But if you add up all the acres of pasture and hay, this is total of all pasture, it really says pasture and hay. We can't separate that out, but is about over 235,000 acres. So there was only I just assumed that a higher percentage of the acreage would be actually receiving litter, but it's only around 10%. And of course, a lot of the poultry litter is being exported now. And again, these are 2019 numbers. I don't have, if you go back 20 years ago, I don't have those numbers. It may be different. Okay, so let's go ahead and move into calibration. We're going to be looking at some calibration results here in just a second. And we have, like I said, we have monitoring data at each of those. On the map on the left there, it's showing the triangles there that shows some of the locations where we have data. Actually, we're blessed with having a pretty good bit of data in this watershed. There's some of the other watersheds we deal with in Arkansas. We might have, a station here, a station there, and, just much more sparse data. So we're, like I say, blessed to have a lot of monitoring data. And that's crucial. I mean, you can, well, going back to what Greg was saying, you can run models all day long. If you don't have something to compare it to, then you're really guessing. And sometimes that's all you have, but it's just so much, so useful and so valuable to have all the monitoring data that we do have. We ran the model starting from 1990 all the way through 2020. We consider the first 6 years to be or excuse me, first 5 years or 6 years, sorry, to be kind of a warm-up period so that when we're looking at our results, they won't be influenced by guesses we had to make at initial conditions for the model. So we calibrated to conditions from 1996 through 2020. Okay, for stream flow, you'll see each of those locations there show where we were able to have stream flow data for calibration. Now, the categories you see on the left, those were not something we just made up. When it's like, oh, I think that's good or bad. Those are based off statistics that are and a calibration criteria that have been published. I think it's back in 2007 by a gentleman. I think Moriasi, I think is how I pronounce the name, and then some others that were in on that. But like I said, it's a peer-reviewed publication, and that's a widely used set of calibration criteria. It includes some statistics such as what's the Nash-Sutcliffe efficiency, which is basically kind of a goodness of fit type of parameter, and then also the percent bias, which shows, well, are you all high or all low? And then I forget what, Brad, what was there? Wasn't there one more in there?
KGE, Cardinal, efficiency.
Yeah, KG, what he said. I can't remember. And I have to. And so anyway, like I say, it's got several statistics in there. And like I say, it's a widely used set of criteria that people use when calibrating watershed models. So like I say, with stream flow, hopefully you're able to, calibrate pretty well most of the time. And like I say, these all fell into the good or very good category. For suspended sediment loads, like I say, we had a little bit wider range of calibration results here. Again, you see, like I say, really blessed, like I say, to have, usually you don't see this many dots on a map when we show calibration results. So we had one place there that's flagged with an unsatisfactory result, but we never could really nail that down, what was going on there in the model. We did have, you see a station, the next station just a short ways downstream did come out with a very good calibration. So we thought, well, okay, we're at least calibrating, pretty well to the station farther downstream. And like I said, we did have, there were a couple of them that just, in various places that just met satisfactory. So like I said, suspended sediment, it's a little trickier than just dealing with flow. With flow, if you get the rainfall right, and the water's got to go somewhere. So a little different with suspended sediment. And a lot of times we don't have you may have data at different places, but it may not be what you really need in terms of including storm loads and that type of thing. And and of course, some of the stations here, we've got observed data from different organizations and agencies that are monitoring for different purposes at different frequencies and stuff. So we tried to blend that together as much as we could. And glad to have as much as we have. So there's your sediment calibration, total nitrogen, like I said, it's sum of nitrate, nitrite, ammonia, and organic nitrogen. Again, most of those, as you can see, fell out into the very good category. And again, a lot of different places where we had data there. Now, not all of these data points will have, in fact, probably only a small number of them have data throughout the entire calibration period. Some of them will just have data during part of the calibration period, but if it's still, 10 years or something, that's still, we can still use that. So that like I say, helps guide our modeling. Total phosphorus, again, looks about the same. Again, that's the sum of both the dissolved and the particulate phosphorus there that's being simulated by the model. And I guess that's pretty self-explanatory there. And so, okay, so that's the calibration. Then we start looking at, okay, well, what are our loads? What are some of the average annual loads that we're looking at, not just at the monitoring locations, but throughout the watershed and all the different HUC-12. So we've got this mapped out here, and these are the loads of sediment that are being simulated at the outlet of each HUC-12 minus what's coming in from any upstream HUC-12s. So it's it incorporates any upland loads of sediment and erosion, as well as stream bank erosion. It's this combination of that. And I will say, this is scaled from 0 up to kind of what the highest one was. So when you see like the upper part of Barren Fork, we see that as see something dark there, it doesn't mean the sky is falling. It just means it's higher than other subwatersheds in there. So, and if I remember correctly, Quan Hong, the gentleman at FDN who actually did all the modeling here, I got to give him credit. I think because I was asking, okay, what, tell me why that was higher. And he said, like, particularly that one that you see on Barren Fork, that was just some areas that had higher slopes. And that was the main things, like I say, some higher slopes. And I started to say the land use may have been a little bit different, but I think it's mainly some of the slopes compared with the one just to the upstream side there. Where you see, one was, much lower upstreams, and well, the slopes were much milder. In that one that's the highest, about 47% of the land had a slope greater than 10%. So, that's what you're seeing there. And let me move to now this next one shows stream bank erosion. What you see in the color shading corresponds to the legend. So that is the tons per hectare per year for stream bank erosion. And I know stream bank erosion occurs on a linear basis. We're accustomed to looking at it, per foot, per mile, whatever. But in order to compare apples with the total sediment yields, we put it on, we just divided it by the HUC 12 areas. So that's what the numbers are. The color shading corresponds to that. But then you also see, boy, that's pretty hard to read from the back of the room, but some of the percentages on there, the percentages, I'll just kind of give you some of the numbers. The percentages on there are, that's what percent of the total sediment load was estimated to come from stream bank erosion. And those numbers range from 0 to 77%. But Quan Hong was telling me that 77%, that's in the area where that includes some of the area downstream of Flint Creek Lake, where SWEPCO has their lake. And so that acts as a sediment trap. So that distorts some of the calculations. Most of the numbers, aside from that one, range from 0 up to, below, 38% was in also the Flint Creek watershed, but the rest of them are below 30. So, and some of those are low simply because, yes, there's some stream bank erosion occurring, but it also is estimating some deposition of that erosion before it leaves the HUC 12, as I understand it. So the model, it looks at stream bank erosion, but also looks at deposition as well. And what you're seeing here is a kind of a net result. Okay, total nitrogen here. The areas with the highest load are kind of right there around the kind of close to the lower end of Osage Creek. And those were some areas that were receiving a good bit of poultry litter. And I think I have some of the numbers there like that. There's two sub-basins there that look almost look like they're merged into one, but at least that one of them I know had 1,700 tons of poultry litter applied on 2,700 acres, which is only about 0.6 tons per acre. That's not the tons per acre is not jumping off the page, but there was, like I said, there was a pretty good bit of poultry litter applied there, and that's one of that, and there was just a lot of pasture in that subwatershed. So that seemed to be what was kind of pushing some of the results up there. And again, like I say, it's the color scaling is just from the lowest to the highest. And you can't really take these loads and say, you can't compare them to like a water quality standard or something, say, okay, yeah, this one exceeds some threshold, or no, it's really just kind of on a relative basis. That's how we're looking at it here. Total phosphorus, the areas there that were the highest are partly around Ballard Creek, and then the lower part, well, I say lower part of the part of the main stem of the Illinois close to the state line. And I believe those were some areas that had a combination of erosion, which is carrying particulate phosphorus with it, as well as I believe this, I may state that wrong. I know they have a little bit more sediment, and I think it was also some fair amount of poultry litter applied in some of those areas. So like I say, combination of things that were causing some of those areas to be a little bit higher. So the way that we're going to be using these results that you just saw is one of the things that goes into the sub-watershed ranking. And that's what Tate had mentioned we'll be talking about at the next meeting is prioritizing sub-watersheds to see, you know, where can we get the most bang for the buck, and also part of the idea behind prioritizing sub-watersheds is that if you as much resources as there are out there, if you spread everything evenly over a large area, you may not have enough to kind of get going on bigger projects, and may not have enough to really see have a measurable impact in certain areas. So that's part of the idea behind sub-watershed prioritization. So that's the next step that we'll be for which we'll be using these model results. And with that, I will conclude. That's got my contact information and Tate's. The people who did the brain people that did all the work on this were my coworkers. Quan Hung Lin did the modeling. Kelsey Crystal out of our Fayetteville office did the graphic design on the slides, and Christina Lauren out of our Little Rock office helped with a lot of the content as well. So many thanks to them as well. And next up will be Brad Rogers, talk about the Oklahoma. Oops. I don't know where yours be at the bottom. Is it? Should be. I'll let you know.
How do I make it? Oh, there it goes. Good. I got it. Yeah, when I went over to presentation mode. Okay, so I'm actually not an engineer, even though I actually do use models. I'm an environmental scientist, but I tend more towards the geomorphology and hydrology end of environmental science. So I'm an environmental scientist that uses models. That being said, when we started this project, we had started working with Texas A&M on a larger project to set up a program called Oklahoma Hawks, which is a statewide modeling program. You can't hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. So we had started working with Texas A&M. Texas A&M works with the Agricultural Research Service to develop and maintain SWAT. So they're kind of the keeper of the entire program. They had been working with EPA nationally to develop Hawks. It was a nationwide watershed model that's online and cloud-based. So it's pre-packaged. You can go in and click on your watershed, and you can set it up and run a model. It's really efficient. We wanted one a little more refined than that. So I started talking to them. They said, we gave them a list of things that we wanted for it. And they said, sure, we can do that. And we said, well, how about you advise us on the Illinois River project? And he said, we can do that too. So we started working with Texas A&M at that time to set up Oklahoma Hawks and include the Illinois River as part of that, and include Dr. Srinivasan as part of our advisory group. So with that being said, we're working with them on a larger state project. The Illinois River is part of that. So we've been a little bit behind because we're working as part of a larger group. As part of that, okay, so I put it at the top. I've got the website on there. Because we're working through this website, this will be the base model on the public view watershed model when we get it finished. So maybe as soon as October, but by the end of the year, everything that we have with this model is available for you to go sign up for Oklahoma Hawks. That up to Texas A&M, et cetera. So you can sign up, it's free, you can go in, log in, you can look at all the calibration, you can run your own scenarios, you can look at all the inputs and do everything that you would want if you're so inclined to work with the watershed model. Okay, so as part of that process, because FTN in Arkansas was a little bit ahead of us in developing their model, and we restarted the HSPF process with the EPA, we worked hard to make sure that we were coordinating with everybody to get all of our inputs as similar as we could possibly get with everybody else. So we've been working a little bit behind. We just got our most recent results on Tuesday. So we haven't had time internally to go through the model ourselves and really dig into it and figure out exactly what's going on everywhere. So we're presenting to you very preliminary results. And we've only scraped the surface of it. Like Greg and Tate have already said, we haven't had time to dig in with their model and figure out, we know setup, what's a little bit different. We haven't had time to compare our outputs exactly and figure out what's going on there. So there'll be a few things to kind of consider there. Our model uses the HUC-12s themselves as subbasins. So the Arkansas model used the internal hydrologic processing to develop their own subbasins. So theirs are a little smaller. They had something 50 something for the Arkansas side. We have, I think, what does it say? 48, I think, HUC-12 subbasins for the entire Oklahoma and Arkansas side. So we'll just go through kind of the basic stuff. We use the HUC-12, we use the NHD stream layer, which is a USGS product for our streams within the model. We use the Sergo county level soil survey, which is a digital survey. We use NLCD 2019, so it's a National Land Cover Data Set. It's a USGS project based on satellite images. And we combine that with the process that Texas A&M did that took the National Agricultural Statistics Survey crop data layer, which is done annually, and it gives you more specific, instead of just saying crops, it'll give you specific crops, so it's soybean or corn or whatever it is. And then it breaks out the urban from one class into 4 classes. And that's partially because we're using it for our statewide data set that we went ahead and included in this. And then the National Wetland Inventory for the wetland. We used the PRISM weather data, which is similar. We did not use wind data. We let the model do that internally. It has its own weather generator that it uses. We use a 10-meter digital elevation model. We use the most current point sources that we could get. We use setup as similar management scenarios for urban areas and for pasture, grazing, cattle, hog, et cetera, that we could with Arkansas, and with previous modeling efforts, including the original HSPF model, which was the beginning of the compact effort. And then our verification data, we looked at the natural stream bank erosion, natural state streams, stream bank erosion study. We did not put a lot of focus on stream bank erosion at this point. There are a couple of quirks with how Hawks works online, that it's not as, you can't input the same parameters you can on the desktop model. So you'd have to pull it out of the cloud version and do that on your desktop if you wanted to change some of those parameters. So we'll get to that eventually, but it's not going to be part of this effort. We use the USGS flow gauges for calibration, and then we used the water quality data from the DQ, IRWP, RC, and USGS. Okay, some of this is just kind of reiterating the point. Land use breakdown, roughly 40% pasture, 40% forest across the watershed. About 6% of the entire watershed is urban, and that's broken out in between high density, low density, medium density, et cetera. I think there's just a little bit of range, but primarily we're still looking at pasture and forest. So because of the way SWOT, to simplify the calculations within the model, SWAT creates hydrologic response units. And that's just taking within each subbasin, it takes a land use, so it takes all the pasture that's on a specific soil series with a specific slope category, and it batches all that together, and it does all the calculations for that at the same time. And because this was developed, the original model was developed 25, 30 years ago, they didn't have a lot of computing power. Now we have a lot more computing power now, but it's still a really efficient way to do the model. So the model still creates these hydrologic response units. It's possible that you can go in, you can set an area or a percentage or a number of HRUs that you want to work with. And that just depends on how you want to look at the outputs, the level of detail you want. So we went ahead and left all of them. We didn't exclude anything, or we didn't exclude anything. We didn't roll anything into the other. So we have something like 6,900 HRUs. That's 982,000 acres. All of them are used. Those are the same outputs. So we did from 1998 through 2020, a 2-year warm-up period. So you typically do a warm-up period with the model, and that lets the model get started because it's starting from scratch. It gives it a few years to get rainfall, to get flow, to get plant growth. And then after that 2 years, then it starts recording. So internally, first 2 years, the model's running, but it's not recording anything. And then you get to 20 years after that. We did the daily output. Okay, so we also included the point sources. Some of this is a little bit busy. I know a lot of this is going to be really hard to see in the audience. Some of it's going to be way more information than a lot of you are interested in, but we're going to go ahead and put it out here. We'll make this presentation available. So anyone that's inclined that wants to look into the details of which point sources or the calibration data that we have, you can go access that. There were a few point source modifications where flow is actually added to subbasin 8, 16, and 17 to help with the flow calibration. We included the NRCS ponds as PL, PL 566 structures throughout the watershed. That was the most up-to-date thing that we could get for that. The ponds are actually included in the calculations, so they act as a sediment retain or sediment flow. So that's actually part of the calculation within each of those subbasins. Okay, so kind of the breakdown a little more specifically of total pasture. So there's about 68% in Arkansas to 32-ish% in Oklahoma. Applied hog manure was in Arkansas. So we don't have any active hog farms or dairy farms in Oklahoma, at least that we know of. None that we could find. And then as far as cattle grazing, I'm gonna have to look at those numbers. I guess that's, I don't know what those percentages are. Do you remember why those don't add up? Yeah, that must be what percentage is actually, what percentage of pasture has cattle on it. And then poultry, how much was applied? Yeah, I think those are acres of pasture, and then how much is applied, what percentage it's applied to, I should say. Okay, so poultry litter management. I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but these are kind of generally, again, if you want to dig into this a little bit deeper, we can send you a copy of this, or we may put it on our website. But the acres that's applied to, the percentages, how much nitrogen, how much fertilizer is applied. These should be really similar to the values that we got from FTN. Grazing. This is just kind of how the model sets it up. So you can set the land cover to growing. You have a minimum biomass before you start grazing on it. So you're going to give the land a little bit of time to rest. And then as soon as it reaches 1,000 pounds per acre, then you put cattle on it. The model starts modeling cattle on it. We did 75% or so of the watershed grazing at 200 days and about 25% grazing 250 days of the year. Okay, so on to the calibration. So this is the data available that we had for our calibration period. Fortunately, like Philip said, we have really good flow data in both of these. So these are the gauges that were available. Those are the flow times that were available, the water quality time period, and then the water quality parameters that were included, and the general distribution. One of the issues that we've run into with some of the water quality data is because it's really expensive to capture high flow data. Around 2016, we started losing high flow data at some of our gauges. So we don't have water quality data above a certain flow. So we typically have base flow. So that gets tricky into having things to compare to when we get into higher flow events. Oklahoma gauges, availability, etc. Again, a little bit better coverage at high flow, I think. But that's kind of the point of the slides, is just looking at the different stuff.
Important to have data flow versus model.
So we'll get into this a little bit more later. The majority of your loading is going to come at high flow. You're not getting a ton of loading. You'll make it, base flow, certain level of nutrients. Majority of your sediment, majority of your total phosphorus at least, is going to come during higher flow events. For total loading, what's going into what's flowing downstream. So that makes it difficult to know what's happening at that flow rate if we don't have any data to compare it to. Okay, so I didn't intend to get into too much detail on these other than to show that we're pretty well calibrated for flow. I think Texas A&M is satisfied that our flow calibrations are working pretty well. That's kind of the requisite daily flow graph to show you. It's really hard to make out even when you look at it closer because the numbers overlap, and when we put red and blue together, it just looks kind of purpley. But we're pretty satisfied with where our flow calibration is at. Oklahoma flow calibration, same. All of the gauges are hitting within the parameters you would expect to see for the Moriasi paper for flow. And this is for the people that are into this kind of thing. These are the parameters that we use for calibration. So when you do calibration, you're taking your model outputs and you're comparing it to some actual measured parameter, or some measured or observed data. So we have flow data, it's continuous. All of the base values that go into the model, we know there are ranges that can be realistic. They're not necessarily set in a specific place. So with all of the different calculations going on in the model, you know there's realistic values for each of those in the real world. So you use those values and you set things that may not be quite right within your model, and you run it through this other program that runs a whole bunch of different model runs, tweaking each of those parameters a little bit at a time until you find the one that matches right. And it gives you it gives you a couple of different runs, and you look at those and you see, do these parameters fall within realistic values? And that's how you select your calibration at the end. I don't know how badly I've butchered that, but that's kind of generally from flying way up here how calibration works.
So you see if they match the data you have.
So that's what this is telling you. So these values are telling you how close you were. So it's similar to, if you're familiar with R squared, it's similar to that. It's not exactly the same, but you can think of it as the closer you are to one, the better the noise in the model is getting to the actual observed value. And percent bias is just how much over or under it's predicted. And the KGE is somewhere similar to the Nash Sutcliffe, but it apparently makes up for the weaknesses of the Nash cyclone. The other thing on this was all these parameters were calculated or adjusted basin wide. We haven't gone in at a lower level to see if maybe there's differences at certain gauges. And we've calibrated it at the entire basin, and it's still calibrated very well. Okay, because flow is typically observed continuous, you've got a USGS gauge, it's stuck in the water, it's measuring water every 5 seconds or 5 minutes or however often it is. Water quality isn't done that way typically. It's very expensive to collect it continuously. So typically it's done with a grab sample. So you send a person out there, they collect water, and samples are taken on it. So with our data, which we actually haven't used in this model, I don't think, we sample 10 times a year. I don't know how often Arkansas has their samples, but you have a point in time that you sample. And one way you can fill in the gaps on that, so when you're trying to calibrate to it, is use the USGS load estimator. So it's a model that takes the observed data, flow data. I can't remember what all the different things are, but it's basically another model that fills in the gaps between the point sources, so that you have something based on flow to compare your model outputs to. Did I get close on that, Greg, Shannon? Okay, and there's our load S parameters. You can see, it may be really difficult to see. The values in red indicate that load S may not be acceptable to use. Because we don't have high flow data, we're having a hard time getting some of the load S to calibrate very well. So we just won't use that in our other calibrations. The group at Texas A&M may have some workaround for it. So this is our sediment calibration. A few of them are not calibrating well. Again, the red numbers indicate the observations from load S may not be acceptable. So those are still in the process of being adjusted. Oklahoma calibration, again, we've got some gauges. There's some sites that aren't calibrating very well. So that's still a work in progress. These are the parameters that were used for calibrating sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen. Again, applied basin-wide. It hasn't been taken down to a lower level. Okay, so here's our maps. We feel really comfortable with our hydrologic calibration for the flow. We're still working on through some of the sediment or from the sediment and nutrients. Surface runoff follows roughly a pattern we would expect with high curve numbers. The groundwater flow is actually shallow groundwater, so that's things that soak into the soil, and it's going to move sideways and it's going to go into the creek eventually. And then sediment to river, that's how much of the sediment is dislodged from the ground and is flowing actually into the river, not just sitting in place. And those are in quantiles, those aren't. So that's the high end versus the low end. So going back to the importance of having high flow data. So at almost 70% of the load of sediment and phosphorus is occurring at the highest 5% of flow. And then almost 50% of the nitrogen is occurring at the highest 5% of flow. And then the land use distribution. So rangeland is fairly minor. Forest, 19% of the total watershed. Pasture is 74% of nitrogen, 85% of the total phosphorus, and about a little under 70% of the total sediment. Urban is 5.5 and 9%. And then other land is just some other stuff. And it's about 13% of the sediment, but minor for the phosphorus and nitrogen. And then, so continuation, so we're still working through some of the calibration. We're still working with Texas A&M to understand some of what they've done a little bit better. We'll continue to work with Arkansas to make sure that our outputs make sense with each other. We're going to work on scenario development. We're going to look at the difference between the high and low flow within the model, and then the point source contributions. And I think that was all I had. Yep. So.
Well, thank you, Greg, Philip, Brad. That really concludes the technical side of today's meeting. I think what we were going to do now, we are ahead of schedule. Today's meeting was scheduled till 4:30. We had set aside about 45 minutes at the end for Q&A on the model output as it stands now, and just a continuation of conservation practice conversation. So at that point, at this point, really just want to open the floor. We will ask if anybody has questions. We will be passing around a microphone. I go and get it turned on so we can record that in on our online participants. And to our online participants, if you have any questions, comments, please put that in the chat. We will not be answering those directly now, but we will be including those in the meeting minutes and getting those transcribed and like I said, answered in the future. So with that, we're going to open the floor for questions on the technical presentations from Arkansas, Oklahoma, the watershed management plan process, the schedule, or as it transitions, then we'll move into conservation practice discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and open the floor for comment.
I'll break the ice.
Green.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, so these are comments. So later to that being included, modeling conversion comment for now is not including that. Did I get that right? Okay, I just want to clarification on that. So we have data on Osage Creek for the entire watershed on stream-based erosion. We have 2 stream-based erosion prediction curves that were developed for Osage Creek. Part of that was funded by 319 funds and part of it was funded by NRCS. And then we also have similar data. I don't think we have stream-based erosion prediction curves, but we also have extensive data on Clear Creek. And so can you guys still include data? And then we also have smaller basins funded through City of Danville and also EPA grant. It was Wetland Department Development Grant on Owl Creek. So some of the urban areas of Danville. I think we have like 3 different watersheds there. And I think that might cover, but we might even have more than that. So we should get together if you guys are interested in utilizing that data in the model, and we'd like to share that with Oklahoma too. And then my other comment is, so we actually went out with USGS. We paid them to try to get a bedrock sample on the West Fork of the White River during Bakeville. And you go out with a truck and a boom in the middle of the night. And it's really scary. But all of us get to the same point where we don't have those storm samples. And I'm just wondering if we could make an effort because we were unable to collect a bed load sample because the river is just too swift and it just. But we could at least get some water quality data at that time. And I don't know how high of a flow we can go to, but just even having it at the full flow would be, I think, useful, because we always get to, it seems like for years now we get to the same point. We don't have data for when the majority of the load is going to move through the system. Correct. And sometimes we're relying on one data point. So I think, you know, we could work with, and I'm just saying the community environmental practitioners here could work with each other in USGS and come up with a sampling plan and make an effort. And I'm going to just have to say we need to make it safe, because it's scary trying to get those kinds of samples. But we're not going to be able to, when you get the suspended sediment concentration samples, you actually go across the stream and pretty much you're limited on flow when you can do that. And those are very useful as well. I don't know if you guys have any of that kind of data in Oklahoma, and I don't know if there's that kind of data in Oklahoma, but that is also very useful data for calibration purposes. And I think we should make an effort to try to get those types of samples as well, which is different from TSS, or depending on turbidity and TSS model, you know, coming up with a model to predict suspended sediment. So just something to think about.
Thank you.
I want to trade it out.
Okay.
To be cutting in and out.
Okay.
Just want to check.
Okay, thank you, Sandy, for that. And if you do have any technical data, please share with us. And at this point, I think we can, you know, maybe too late to include it in the model, but definitely it can be used to help validate some of the calibration statistics.
Hi,
I've actually got
question. Everybody hear me? Sounds like it's cutting in and out, but I'll try to just keep my voice level. I was wondering what kind of sensitivity analyses have been done on the SWOT model to determine which parameters are contributing the most. It sounds like flow rate is one of those parameters. That
and then the second question.
Speak real loud.
Okay, so
Oh, my second
point is, I assume you guys are going to folks are going to use the SWOT model as an adaptive management tool where the data are going to be continually updated and used to produce model results from year to year. Is that true?
So let me just make sure and capture the questions correctly. First question was really looking at what sensitivities went into the certain parameters, and two was, is the SWOT model going to be used as an iterative or adaptive management tool? To the first question, I'm going to defer to Philip or Brad to answer that question.
Do I need to think?
Yeah.
Yeah. And we definitely need to try to repeat things because I've just got the online folks cannot hear.
Okay.
Is it working? Okay, I don't have an answer for you on the first question. I can get your contact information, check with Srini and see, but I mean, we're just now looking at some of this. And those are questions I'd have too. But the sensitivity analysis is typically done as part of the calibration. So yeah, I can get back to you on that. And the second one, I think, part,
Go ahead.
I think is yes.
Yeah, definitely. And that's kind of what Greg was alluding to and mentioned, I mean, directly, is that in the next meeting, we're going to be looking at really the prioritization and running scenarios. And that's part of that adaptive management of looking at where we can have that highest return on investment for conservation practice implementation on improving water quality. So this was just, again, summary of the draft output. There's going to be a whole section on the actual watershed prioritization, and then we're going to get all of this information from the conservation practice implementation to say if we implemented a blanket
riparian corridors are increased, like Greg said, reduced, or increased nutrient management planning that resulted in 15% phosphorus applications. What did that look like? What was that at the pour points and, ultimately at the end point in the water quality? So short answer, yes.
Let me switch it on one time. I think it's switching channel. I don't know what.
I had to look up what a riparian, is that correct?
Yes.
Riparian law was, but does Oklahoma have one in place now?
So to repeat the question, she's asking if Oklahoma has a riparian law. Are you talking about a riparian area and a regulation that pertains to riparian areas? There's not regulation in terms of guaranteeing every single stream is going to have X amount of this riparian area, right? There's not that kind of a regulation, no. But
That would solve a lot.
so her point is that would solve a lot of problems. And so what she's talking about is that area that's immediately adjacent to the stream out to a certain effectual area affected by the water when it gets up out of its banks and so forth. And so, yeah, that riparian area is a very focused area of management and has been for decades. Now we do have easements. Oklahoma in particular, we've invested, made a great investment in riparian easements. So we're working with producers, working with landowners to help exclude those areas from certain land management activity to protect those areas.
Both states do it.
And both states, yeah, both states are doing that, but I'm just speaking for Oklahoma.
I'm sorry, I should use the microphone. I
Yes.
apologize.
Remember though, we are really talking about voluntary processes. The focus of this program is to, what are the things we can do to encourage people to make decisions about how they're going to manage their own land. And all of our programs only have authority to work through voluntary processes. So we can certainly listen to people proposing that they would like to see regulation. But what we have the ability to work on are voluntary programs.
Great.
You can encourage your municipality to adopt something like that or stream side.
So just to repeat, there is someone that gave a comment that you can encourage people to adopt something like the Fayetteville Streamside Ordinance, Stream Protection Ordinance. So that's a particular municipal ordinance related to their incorporated area, right?
Thank you.
I've
Got a couple of
questions. So
I think I talk pretty loud, but
That's
let's go in and out. So this is a question to Philip. When you were actually talking about the amount of phosphorus that was applied, was that just for 1 year? I think you talked about 2019. And if it was just for 1 year, why you're not including all the other years where you have data? Because there's a legacy phosphorus issue in there. And 1 year is probably not representative of the cumulative amount of phosphorus that's in this.
Sure. Don't need this question.
Whatever. Yes. Yeah, let's go ahead and step up here.
Okay.
I think it'd be good, Nate, probably for someone to stay there. Repeat.
Oh, okay,
Because Marianne said-
I'll repeat the question. And the question was, in the Arkansas model, we used poultry litter application from 2019. And why didn't we use the data from other years as well? Cumulative. Okay. And the answer is that we used the 2019 numbers and assumed that occurred every year throughout the simulation. So it's obviously that's not going to be totally accurate on previous years, but it was, as my understanding, that was a pretty good effort on NRD's part to compile all the data that are submitted by individual producers, to compile all that for 2019. Like I said, we don't have that compiled for previous years. And that information probably doesn't go back before the nutrient management plan requirements, I assume. and like, cause like I say, it's not something that producers all put into a database where you just gotta punch a few buttons and here it is, and it's reported, I guess, on paper forms probably to soil water conservation districts, and that took a little bit of effort to compile, but that was the most recent data we had. And like I say, I know if you go back, like I say, I'm assuming that probably the export numbers were probably lower going back in time, I'm guessing. So yeah, that may be a case. Now, we do have, when you're talking about the phosphorus in the soil, we do have, we put in numbers for the beginning of the simulation, what the soil phosphorus numbers are. And we got that from some of the previous modeling efforts. And I probably should have mentioned that, you know, Greg talked a little bit about how what we're doing is, you know, updating previous modeling efforts. And we didn't take those exact files and feed them into our model, but we used a lot of information from previous modeling efforts. Because those of you who have been around and have followed this for a while, you're probably thinking, okay, yeah, I've seen a number of models out there for the Arkansas side of the Illinois River Basin. And so, like I say, this was an update. Like I said, we did use a lot of numbers, including some of the soil test phosphorus numbers from previous efforts. That address what you're asking?
Hello, I would like to know if who is the landfill in Tawny Town is being monitored for chemicals and other pollutants that are going into the streams and creates leaking to the Illinois watershed.
So the question was regarding the Tawnytown landfill and water quality monitoring and runoff. So that's actually a regulated question for Arkansas DEQ. That wouldn't be part of this management plan because that's again a regulated entity. So that would be really a question for them. But there are monitoring requirements within their permit.
Okay. I know you accounted for poultry litter in the modeling, but was commercial fertilizer included in the urban and agricultural?
So the question was whether commercial fertilizer was applied in the model to both urban and rural landscapes.
Yes, and I know for Arkansas, I'm pretty yeah. Brad's shaking his head for Oklahoma too. In both models, yes, the application of commercial fertilizer for lands that did not receive poultry litter, pasture lands, that was included in the model for rural areas, and then urban. We did assume some numbers for fertilization of lawns, and again, those numbers came from previous modeling efforts. So we tried to not reinvent the wheel on some of that type of stuff.
So, you know, the source for the usage of commercial fertilizer in Oklahoma and in Arkansas, what's the source? Where do you get that information?
Okay, the question was, what is the source of the numbers for the commercial fertilization? I don't remember off the top of my head. Brad, you happen to remember? It was, I mean, I know we took it from a particular study, but I can't remember where they got it.
Off the top of my head, I don't know.
Yeah, we can look that up and try to include that in the meeting summary.
Yeah, please. I'm not aware that those numbers exist anywhere.
Well, and it's, you know, in a lot of these modeling efforts, we don't have precise numbers on a lot of things, and so you wind up kind of drawing conclusions or you know, making assumptions from some limited data of somewhere, and so that's probably where those came from. But
there's published papers too that some of it just comes from previously published models or academic papers or something like that. So it's kind of an assumed rate that you're going for, and it's meant to be more of an average over the entire watershed and not just specifically this person versus this person versus this person. We're still just trying to smooth it out over the whole thing, so you don't have that fine resolution of information. Did that answer the question? I want to make sure to ask that.
No, it doesn't. Thank you.
I was going to say my SWOT modeler is texting here, and he referenced the report, but I don't think it some stuff published by Dan Storm in 2010 from Oklahoma State, but we don't have the at this off the top of our head, we don't have the exact numbers source of where he got those numbers.
My question is, Northwest Arkansas is growing very fast. How far out do you look at areas and particularly like land development cover optimization? So is it 2050? Is it typically 5, 10, 15 years out?
So the question was, how far in a time series does the model or this process look due to given the growth rate of Northwest Arkansas? So this model isn't really set up to do time series scenarios. It's more of a current condition model. So looking at the data we have available that, Greg did a really good job explaining, what data do we have available now? And if we were to implement those practices, what kind of anticipated result will we see? It's not well, we anticipate land use to change and increase urban by 20%. We don't have that capability within this model to do those types of scenarios. If it can, I'm not aware of it.
It can't be, I mean. Projected MLR.
Yeah, so it is possible to do that. You would just do a land use update, and there are packages in SWOT already that can use weather generator within the model, which uses an average. So that's probably not gonna be real helpful if you're considering like climate change scenario. We do have some of the climate change models that we will be putting into Hawks. USGS has a couple of products that have a population growth model built into them. I've started looking into them, and I haven't figured out if they're really appropriate to use for something like this, because they were done for carbon sequestration or some effort like that, at least the first ones that I found. I found some other ones the other day that maybe are more appropriate. But if you know of a urban growth model that's been used for Northwest Arkansas, and you have an idea how spatially that's going to be distributed, we can go in and you can break it up and do, this much percentage pastures can be changed into urban areas or something like that, or it forward. So, but you're not going to have anything to compare it to, so it's still just a pretty rough estimate.
I do want to say that that's a good comment for additional questions if you're thinking about given what we're talking about for the next meeting of potential scenarios. So I mean, that's something we can take back and talk with FTN and internally in the technical work group of what type of scenarios do we, because we already have ideas on what we need to be focused in on from the non-point source side from our typical land use management aspects. But if that's something I think stakeholders are really concerned about, then we can definitely look and try and be figuring out what that time series land use change looks like moving forward as a scenario. So saying that, we can definitely entertain additional questions on the models. I mean, we have ample time, but also if you think about what the land use is changing like or conservation practice implementation, I think we would be open to hearing from you on that, on what potential scenarios might look like.
Thank you. I have one more question.
Are you also including the information
From
industrial nutrient application in Arkansas?
Is that data also being included in the model?
Yeah, question is, are we including nutrients from industrial nutrient application, like people that collect that and distribute that? Well, okay, I'm going to answer this off the top of my head, thinking out loud here. So if somebody's applying nutrients in a nutrient surplus area, which Illinois River in Arkansas is, you should have a nutrient management plan. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, regardless of the source of nutrients. Obviously, I think there's some thresholds in there, but so if I'm correct about that, then yes, that would be included, that would be reported. Not that and like I said, we don't have individual producer information that's protected under privacy laws, but like I say, that should be part of what got grouped together by the 12 information that was compiled by NRD. It's probably, I guess we're maybe calling it, we're lumping it in with poultry litter, but like I say, it's it's nutrients that are being applied there. I think that's an accurate statement there.
Right, and ultimately, it's a regulated discharge, and so if captured in the data pool for fitting under any of these scenarios for dairy and hog farms, actually, that's probably where it would land for, even though it's an industrial application and a regulated application, that's where it would be included in this model. That's why I wanted to pull up this slide.
Does that mean you recall the point sources?
Yeah.
Even though it's still in stand application of the following, or you would have to do it in that's sort of a different. If you're modeling that's a different.
I think,
It's different.
I think the individuals have to have their own permit to land apply treated biosolids.
Okay, so the question was, would what we were just talking about, the application of biosolids by an industrial applicator. The question was, would that be considered a point source, or would it be? Well, okay, so the question is, would that have been included with what we label as point sources on our slide there? And the answer is no, because the point sources were just NPDES discharges. What we could, and that's the case for both models here. And so, like I say, that would have, at least in our model, that would have, like I say, that would have been lumped in with what we were counting as we're calling poultry litter application, just as a land application. Even though it's regulated, it's still would have been pulled into the model in that way.
Any other comments on the model scenarios? Just questions for, any of the staff here today? Okay.
I'd like to make one more suggestion. I think it would be really important, especially since we're just seeing the outputs from the SWOT model today, and these are preliminary outputs, but to be able to add and include additional data that CE has offered and maybe others in this room have, so that because you've definitely got some challenges up here in some certain areas, and that would be very helpful to tune your model and calibrate a bit more. So I hope that you can add another month or two or whatever it takes to add that additional good information.
So the comment was on the floor was really just encouraging both states and consultants to use all readily available data and to take that into consideration. And we've taken what we've had available that we could easily gather, and not even easily at times, but so a lot of data has gone into this, and we will be taking a lot of this. We've still got a lot of work, as it's been mentioned before, to come back and really do a deep dive from a technical aspect into this model output. And so this may be a tentative schedule. I just want to make that very clear. We've anticipated possibly November to December to have this fourth meeting, but I want to caution that if we get into, especially if we add more data, if we go back and because that takes a lot of time to go back in and add new data, calibrate the data, and across the spectrum. I just caution that if we start introducing a lot of new data at this point in the game, it does add a lot more time to this process. But we will definitely consider that and talk with people that are better modelers than everyone in this room, and look at the feasibility of that.
Add to that. We have time. We will be continuously updating our Oklahoma Hawks model. So it may not be part of this final report, depending on how far it pushes our timeline back, but we intend to be into that for the long haul. So anybody that has data that you think may be useful, get in touch with us. We'll talk about it. If you'd like to send it to us, we can take a look at it. As long as you've got documentation and QATs and things like that, it's something that we can actually stick in the model. We may just do something that uses qualitative comparison But the model will continually be updated in Oklahoma Hawks over time. So I'll just add that.
And again, this is not your last opportunity to provide comments or feedbacks to any of us. We didn't provide our contact information, and I'll put it back up there again. At the conclusion of this meeting, we will still be here. This meeting was scheduled till 4:30. I'm not trying to close the conversation now. It seems to be a lull in the question asking. So I'm able to stay here as long as it takes to answer as many questions. I know Oklahoma is as well and FTN. So that said, at the end of this, we will provide a meeting summary with all the meeting presentations and meeting recording. It may take us a few weeks to get this summarized and digitized and get the transcript from this meeting out to you all, but you all will get it. And that's the importance of signing in the back. If you haven't done it, I encourage you to do it because we don't want to leave anybody off this list. So we are not getting everybody the information properly. Yes. One more question. I got it. Great.
Now it's talking about contribution practices. So, a lot of cons, like, and so I would just like to talk a little bit about administration, in the sense that the useful cost and expensive projects that the same thing with IRWP.
So I guess there was a little bit of confusion perhaps on my part. The floor has always been open to discuss conservation practice implementation. And some of the discussions from the last meeting, the comment was when I was presenting this, it seemed like a lot of cons and very few pros. And so just opening the conversation up about stream bank restoration and riparian restoration and the benefits, albeit expensive to implement, do have significant load reductions for sediment and sediment bound nutrients. So with that, we can open the floor for discussion about conservation practices. I landed on the rural practices, but I can toggle back and forth to urban depending on anybody's interest. And again, the summary from meeting 2 was sent out to meeting participants. It is posted on IRWP's website. Shannon, do you all have it on? I don't know. I know it's posted on IRWP's website. If you did not receive the email, our contact was up there and we can send out the meeting summary from meeting 2, but it has a really detailed summary of all the stakeholders' comments, some of the limitations and pros. Don't let me think I'm focusing on limitations. There are a lot of pros mentioned. So with that, open it back up.
Hear me okay? No, not at all. Okay, I'll just talk about it. All right, Graham Thompson with the Watershed Conservation Resource Center. So this is a question really about the application of stream bank restoration as a conservation practice and kind of some of the results. So maybe it's a question for Philip, but I think I understood right that Oklahoma is not currently including stream bank restoration. I think you asked that question. Erosion, sorry. So you're not currently including stream bank erosion. And then Philip, just a clarification from you. I think you said that on sediment, total sediment, suspended sediment, did you say stream bank erosion was somewhere around 30%? Is that the number that I heard you say? So obviously this is important as it relates to mitigation practices. If we have some understanding of where the greatest source of sediment is coming from. So that's why I'm putting the question here. So you had said 0 to 77%, but something like 30%. So I just want to clarify that number.
Sure. The question was what about each model and how whether or not stream bank erosion is included. So the Oklahoma model is that going to be added later or?
Well, go ahead.
Okay, Shannon's going to address that, and then I'll come back and address the Arkansas model.
Sorry for so the Oklahoma model did not input any specific numbers into our model or modify our model based on stream bank erosion. But we looked at the stream bank erosion that was being predicted by the model once we had set it up to make sure that it was in line with the numbers that were being predicted by Sandy's and their team's report that Arkansas used. So we kind of used it more as a calibration tool than input to the model, just because of, as Brad said, the way our Hawks model is set up, it's difficult to input it at this point. But we definitely want to use more data if you have more data, at least in that same manner, if not to consider how we incorporate it into the model long term.
I'll add just one more thing. And just keep in mind that SWAT is a hydrologic model. So it does have a sediment transport module, but it's not doing hydraulics in the stream itself. So it doesn't know how powerful the water is moving through the channel. So it's going to give you a load. It can give you an idea where the load is coming from. It can give you an idea what load is transported through that section of stream, but it's not going to say this section is where the bank erosion is going to happen. That would be a separate hydraulic model you would have to run. You need pretty high resolution transects and things like that to do those type of models well.
Right, thanks. And okay, so Graham, going back to your question on the Arkansas side, we did include stream bank erosion there, and you saw some of the numbers on the screen those were estimates of the percentage of the total sediment load that was coming from stream bank erosion. And yes, those numbers over most of the subwatersheds were, like say, in the below 30%. We're still looking at those numbers, and like Brad said, it's tough to know how accurate those numbers are. The data you guys are getting and providing, like I say, the more data we have, the better on because that's in the past, that's been one of our biggest limitations is, okay, we may have some stream bank erosion that's estimated here or there or something. It's like, well, but how much are we getting in between those sites and, over the whole subwatershed? And so that's been part of our problem. And like I say, so Sandy, appreciate you volunteering to provide us some additional data. But like I say, so that's kind of where we are, Graham.
And just a follow-up question as it relates to the results, then kind of guide priorities. I think if I understand your results right, you were talking about you had sediment loads or delivery at nodes or at outpour points, and I think Brad had maybe noted sediment delivery to the river. So I noticed that like he had like Osage Creek had really high sediment delivery to the river, but in your model Osage Creek was pretty low because I'm assuming that by the time it gets to the outflow, maybe it's not as high. There were some differences, like he had some really hot spots like Osage Creek.
You may have a really high accrual within the river, and maybe that's the explanation for why it might have high delivery to it.
Yeah. So the question was comparing some of the output that was shown today. Some of it looked like usually was it the Arkansas side that you're saying was showing some areas that were low, like along Osage Creek, that looked high on some of the Oklahoma modeling results. Like I say, we're still fine tuning all of that in terms of we're kind of a little bit on a pause schedule wise, like I say, letting the Texas A&M folks catch up, and then like I say, we will do more direct comparisons of model results. But in terms of and I don't know if we were presenting different numbers in terms of.
I was going to comment on that. Another caution for comparing.
Because like I say, you can, depending on what numbers you take out of the model, whether you're looking at just upland erosion, whether you're talking to stream bank erosion, what's the net, you can present numbers in a different way. So we may have been presenting a little bit different numbers here. I'll let Brad respond to that.
And so if you'll remember back, so they used internal hydrologic processing to draw their subbasins. So their subbasins are actually smaller than ours. So we have probably 20 something on the Arkansas side where they have 40 or 50, something like that. So maybe half the size of what we have or something like that. They presented their data as kilograms per hectare. So they were doing per year.
Well, dividing by the somewhat.
Right, so they're doing a load based on the area of that sub-basin where what the maps at least that we showed were in quartiles. So those are relative loading to each other. We didn't present like how many tons are coming off of the landscape or something like that. And then to Philip's point, there are multiple different outputs that you get in the SWOT model. So you may get, I'm blanking on some of this, but your sediment out could be what's happening in the stream channel. So you'll get your reach and you'll get how much sediment goes in and how much sediment comes out. And then the difference in that is how much is staying in there, which gets pushed through if you have really high flow there. Where you also have different, how much sediment is leaving the landscape. You've got different things that you can pick out of. So it kind of depends on what question you're asking, but as far as comparing their maps to our maps, I would remind you that the subbasins don't line up exactly. And they presented a tons per hectare, which is going to be different based on how big their subbasin is, where we were just presenting relative loading to each other. So that would be my caution for making sense of the two maps together.
Finished. One in the back.
I know you put in a ton of work for this watershed. I'm just wondering what the models are all done and have recommendations. How applicable they'll be to neighboring watersheds, like other than Crawford County. I'd love to know if this information can be transferred to like that for surrounding areas. I know this is very specific to this watershed, but.
No, that's a great question and comment on data applicability. So the question was, can this information that's being developed in the Illinois be transferred to adjacent watersheds? And the answer is yes, because a lot of this is really pretty ubiquitous across landscape scale types. So in Crawford County, depending on where you're at, there is already a watershed management plan for the Lee Creek watershed and Frog Bayou, which would be a little bit further. In Arkansas, if you go further to the east, watershed management plans are actively being updated for Beaver Reservoir. To the west, I'm say blissfully ignorant on what's to the west. So that would be a question for Oklahoma, but the short answer is yes. I mean, a lot of these practices, and maybe not the actual data and load reductions per se, but a lot of the information could be applied for local conservation practice implementation.
Are you guys gonna actually present at the next meeting load reductions?
So the question was, in the next meeting, are we going to present on actual load estimate reductions from practices? And then we can include historic data that, Arkansas, as part of the Gulf of Mexico Hypoxia Task Force, has developed a range, or basically a consolidated value and aggregated value for certain practices. And there's a lot of number in literature as well. But in Arkansas, we're using those values to look at load reductions from conservation practice implementation moving forward. So we do have some of those numbers, and we can present that at the next meeting, just so people can see from, say, we implement practice X, which would be exclusionary fencing, what type of load reductions. And Shannon's shaking her head because we have to report this to EPA through our grant reporting tracking system. So anytime we fund a project through our 319 programs, all of that, we have to report a load reduction to EPA. And a lot of that is done through Russell. I don't even know I can't even remember what Russell stands for. And then there's Step L model, or PLET is the new model. And again, these are new models that I can't remember what the acronym stands for. I apologize, but there are EPA approved methodologies for calculating those load reductions and for certain conservation practices. And we can walk through some of that too. I think that would be a good background for a lot of, because we're talking about these conservation practices, but in terms of actual in-stream estimations of loads, what does that really mean? I think that would be a good, that's a good comment. Thank you. Yes, sir.
In your data gathering, did you utilize the information from the commercial fertilizer spreaders, where they spread, how much per acre they spread? Same thing with the groups that are cleaning poultry houses, because I know they're documenting, or most of them do. And then any purchasing records, fertilizer from the Lowe's, Home Depot kind of thing that might go to an urban setting. Were any of those type of data entered on what's been purchased and spread?
To the latter part of that from commercial box stores, I don't think that that data is, I don't even know where that data would even exist. So the short answer is no. I mean, Philip was shaking his head to the commercial application. Unless it's done under a nutrient management plan, then we wouldn't have that information either. So the question was, really, did the model take into account commercial fertilizer application or individual purchases from box store? Is that a fair?
People who clean out poultry.
And people that clean out poultry houses commercially. So my response was basically, unless it's not included in the nutrient management plan in Arkansas's nutrient surplus area or captured under Oklahoma's current regulations, then we wouldn't have that information.
Right, and you know, I don't, going back to the thing about the people that clean out the poultry houses, I know some people have looked at number of poultry houses and stuff like that, and we feel like the data we have is probably a better indication of what's actually applied, assuming that everyone's reporting like they're supposed to be, as opposed to people cleaning out poultry houses. We don't know exactly what happens to all of that. It may be cleaned out. That's
they have to document.
Okay. Well, if they're documenting that should go into that reporting of the information that we were using on the poultry litter. Okay. Yeah, what you're talking about there, he was saying that data should be reported by people who clean out poultry houses. It's got to be documented, whether it's spread or exported or something. And that, yeah, okay. So what you're referring to is the same type. That is the same information that was compiled for us to use on poultry litter. The other stuff, like on checking the commercial fertilizer applicators and stuff, we like I say, we didn't pursue that. We wound up just using like I say, some numbers from a previous study.
And I just want to reiterate, when all of this information gets back out, please, if you have questions, please reach out to Shannon and her team, myself, Philip, and if it comes to one of us, we will definitely share that across both teams, so we are aware, and we will try and get that captured just so we have it and try and get you an answer or responses quickly as we can. So I just want to make that very clear. Okay, Shannon, do you want to have any closing comments? Putting you on the spot.
Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody for being here. One of the challenges of developing watershed management plan is this is not our plan. I love the Illinois River, and I've spent a lot of time in the Illinois River. But this plan is to protect the people who live and work in the Illinois River. And in order for it to be most effective, we need input from those people. Because those are the people that we're going to be asking to make changes in how they live their lives, how they manage their farms, how they maintain their lawns. So those are the people who really need to be helping us make the best decisions about how we prioritize the types of opportunities we're going to have to help them make those changes. So the time that you spent with us today, giving us your input, is very much appreciated. I also want to say great thanks to Tate and his team from NRD for doing a lot of the heavy lifting on these meetings and organizing things and getting things set up. And of course to the Cherokee Nation for their hospitality, continued hospitality in giving us a great place to meet so that we can talk about these things. As Tate said again, please reach out to us if you have further questions about what we're doing, your input. And, we heard a lot of comments about the type of data that we would all like to have and like to be able to input in the model. We have to make the best decisions about the quality of data that's available to us. We don't have a full exact picture of everything that happens in the watershed. So for some of these inputs, we have to use literature values or information from experts about what they believe is happening, what their experience tells them is happening. And sometimes that's really an average representation of what's happening, as opposed to, like several people have referenced, what's happening in individual locations in the watershed. So that's my plug for, we would love to be able to collect more data. But everybody who talks to a scientist, they always complain about all scientists want is more data. We want more decisions, right? So that's part of this watershed planning process. And that's part of the reason that we update these plans from time to time, is we do gain new data, we do gain new information that helps us make better decisions. So again, please reach out to us if you have comments, if you think about other things that we should be considering as part of the model. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Tate for closing.
Thank you, Shannon. I think that was a great closing summary. And again, thank you all for your time this afternoon, your interest and participation in this process. We greatly appreciate it. To the Cherokee Nation again for hosting us in this great venue and participation and support of this process. With that, I just wish everybody travel safely, and again, reach out to us if you have questions. We will be here for through the early evening. If you have any questions, please corner any of us, and we'll please make sure you sign in. Remind me that. Again, if you have any questions, just reach out to us. Thank you all for your interest.
Stand together.